Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted to be with Abdullah Andalusi again. It's good to see you, bro. It's been a long time.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yes, alhamdulillah, it has been some time. We since we last discussed, I think it was a reaction to a previous debate, or was it lecture? I forget which. The atheist had said. It was a debate. Our debate I did actually. Sorry.
Yes.
That was it.
Yeah.
It was on the. I believe it was again reacting to someone in the audience making comments about biology and about whether I forgot the exact argument or point they made. It was something to do with, I think it was something to do with genetics to some extent.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. Why is there so many errors or flaws in DNA copying? Then I think that was the argument. If it was meant to be a perfect system, that was their argument. Yes.
Yeah.
So that was that was them. So yeah, good to reprise our role in reviewing debate, but not my debate or Mohammed Hijab's debate, but with a debate between Piers Morgan and infamous Piers Morgan and even more infamous Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, and I believe you've interacted with Piers Morgan at least on one occasion, so you know that he doesn't hold back with whatever he has. So in this case as well, I was actually surprised how well he did. Considering that Dawkins is, this is his area, speaking about God, speaking about design, speaking about biology. So I think he did surprisingly well. What was your thoughts?
Yes, I feel that. Well, I feel that Piers Morgan actually wasn't properly prepared, because this is a topic outside his expertise. He probably has only a limited number of days to prepare for each interview that he does, and for him, as long as he's being seen to be challenging the opponent or his guest, then he doesn't really care if he has to brush up on more advanced theories of physics, or to actually to make a serious discussion. He's just there to ask questions and be to be challenging, I suppose, to the guest, or attempt to be anyway. Whether he is challenging to the guest or not is a different discussion. But yeah, he's there to make the show of it, I suppose, make a good show of it.
Absolutely. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll play the video and let me know where you want me to pause it, and we'll have a bit of a discussion.
Sure.
Be a power that is greater than the human brain.
God is just a personification of human desires, a supernatural sky daddy.
Do you ever find yourself almost praying and then stopping yourself?
No.
How often do you admit you're wrong?
I don't have to answer all your questions.
You don't have to, but you're a man who normally answers questions.
The origin of life is a tractable problem. It may never be solved, but it's not in the same league as the origin of the universe.
So are you an Oasis fan?
I don't think I know who Oasis is, so it's obviously not.
Richard Dawkins is one of the most controversial and fascinating thinkers in the world. His latest book, The Genetic Book of the Dead, explores how every creature is a living archive of its ancestors and the history of the planet. He's also about to embark on what he says is his final ever tour, and we'll talk about all that and more. But first, I want to know why. After my last conversation with the esteemed professor, which I thoroughly enjoyed, he said this.
There was a recent interview you did with Piers Morgan, and you sort of touched on it. I think it felt like you didn't really believe that he believed that there's this afterlife and God and things like that. And I
said that, yes.
Yeah. How do you think they don't deep down believe it?
I can't speak for them in the abstract. Something made me think Piers Morgan didn't believe. I think Piers Morgan's a fool. So I'm not really much interested in what he believes, actually.
Oh, you said something similar off air, and I didn't think you would repeat it. Well, he interrupts a lot, doesn't he?
Sure, I'm going to say that again.
Well, Mr. Dawkins joins me exclusively again now to do battle with the fool. Richard, I thoroughly enjoyed our last conversation. But why would you turn on me like that afterwards?
I did too. Well, I've already explained that to your people why I did.
Well,
And I would
I
say
haven't heard it
again, but
yet.
it was nothing to do with what. Oh, okay. Well, in that case, they're remiss in not telling you, but I'll tell you afterwards. But it was nothing to do with anything you said. It was a question that you asked me that I thought you shouldn't have asked me.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I think there was a subject matter you didn't want to discuss.
There was a very good reason for that. I explained that to your people. They should have passed it on to you. I don't know why they didn't.
Okay, but just to be clear, you don't think I'm a fool?
I do not. I was irritated by one question that you asked me, which I think should not have been, and I simply forgot to ask you not to ask it. I nearly always do ask you not to ask that question.
Okay, well, we can move forward in the spirit of mutual non-foolishness.
Let's move forward. I do not think you're a fool, no.
Thank you. Well, I would hope not, because you're back on the program, and it's great to have you, and I love talking to you. Let's talk about this issue of...
If we can actually make requests to Piers Morgan not to ask us particular questions, every single Muslim and pro-Palestine activist has one or two questions we would put forward to say, please don't repeat yourself endlessly by asking the same question you're infamous for. So the do you condemn question. But so I didn't know that Piers Morgan takes requests. So it's takes requests and grants them. But all right, so that's interesting.
Yeah. When you appeared on Piers Morgan, I saw that the way that you were conducting yourself and the way that you were speaking, it was very much like a stroll in the park. You're like, oh, I'm here talking to this guy again. But I feel a sense of nervousness from Dawkins. Do you sense that?
Maybe to some extent. I mean, Rich Dawkins, he might be so self-assured in his beliefs, but obviously he knows that he is not able to always deal with the rhetoric of his opponent. And Piers Morgan is famous for obviously an attempt at doing rhetoric to make an argument sound strong. So obviously he might be having some trepidation against Piers Morgan, thinking, what's he going to come out with now? And so, because I think he prefers an interview where people just ask him his ideas and beliefs, and that's it, with not that much challenge. Although I know that he does anticipate challenge, and he came on this show. He didn't have to come on this show, so he might have. But obviously, there is a slight trepidation in him, whether he can actually deal with any curveballs, as the Americans would say, that Piers Morgan will throw him. So let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Of God, because we had a long chat about this last time. I do believe, for what it's worth, I do believe in God. I do believe in an afterlife. I find it comforting. I also find, as I said to you last time, I find it explains things which are otherwise completely inexplicable. And we had a guest on recently, Professor Stephen C. Meyer, who's a prominent believer in intelligent design, or what he calls the God hypothesis. He watched our last interview that you and I had, and this is what he said about it.
Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies, and he'll concede that, well, it's possible, but I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case, and that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest. And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes that traditional theists have traditionally associated with God.
You see,
So before we continue with, what Dawkins is going to respond with, the inference to the best explanation is something that I'm sure you, as a debater who's probably had more than 50, 60 debates, probably more than that, I'm sure you've come across this and you've utilized this principle. What do you think is the usual response to this when you've used it in debates?
Yeah, well, it's actually 100 debates, but I'm just it's in various platforms. But on the topic of atheism, obviously, it's been obviously a more limited number than that. So usually the kind of discussions that many atheists bring is they bring scientific speculations. Sorry, let's clarify that. The speculations of people who practice science, but not actual science. So science is that which is testable, observable, detectable in some way, shape, or form. It might be a valid hypothesis to explain it, or otherwise known as a theory. And I use theory in the philosophical sense, meaning just an attempt at an explanation or providing a possible explanation, but we don't have necessarily evidence for that theory being the one out of all the possible theories. So there are many theories, and in the philosophical sense, presented by people who practice science. And what they tend to do is they bring in philosophical naturalism, the assumption that there is only material things. There's nothing beyond matter, quote unquote, matter and energy. So they tend to bring ideas such as a multiverse theory. There's multiple universes, and every moment they splinter off into each possibility is actualized in a separate universe. So every slight deviation from like if you'll get up in the morning and you choose to have cornflakes, and there's not a universe where Sabor woke up and chose to have toast. So and that down to the very subatomic level, right? So each subatomic particle making a different change. So this is a Everettian hypothesis, the idea that there is multiple universes for each possibility. There are ideas of an oscillating universe, so that there was, I'm going to put this rather crudely, of course, that there was a previous universe to this, and it kind of ended up in a big crunch, and then now we're in expansion, and that eventually will end up in a big crunch, and so on and so forth. Or there is a multiverse in the sense of multiple bubble universes being produced by a wider, larger universe. And so the universe will be created by a quantum nucleation event. I'll get to that in a second. And then they create a universe, and the universe expands and then eventually dies off due to entropy. And then but all the universes are created in this big sea, you could say, a sea of different that is bubbling and popping out new universes. So all these are theories. Is there any evidence for any of these theories? Well, or any compelling evidence, at the very least? No, absolutely not. There's as much evidence for multiverse as there is for Thor and Zeus. So there is really not really any theory. But what many physicists like to do is, because obviously physicists, when I say physicists, materialist, philosophical naturalist physicists, is they want to bring their ideology with them, and make hypotheses. And now many other physicists, which I respect more, have said and responded to all these wild or wacky theories, especially when trying to explain quantum mechanics, where there are some not well understood situations occurring on the subatomic level. The famous phrase is, and any physicist student who studies at the higher level, degree level, will tell you this. They heard this phrase before. Shut up and do the maths, right? Right? Which is, stop bringing in all these weird and wacky theories that you ought to explain, to kind of put color on and embellish the mathematics. The mathematics just shows that the relations between observable quantities. Leave it like that. As to what is going on, really, we don't know. But as long as we can make accurate predictions based on observed relationships between quantities of things, that's all we care about, right? As physicists, we want a mathematical model of how things work. We want to know the how, We don't care about the why. We don't care about why there's a universe. Why is there something exists out of nothing? We, in essence, it's like a car mechanic. A car mechanic doesn't care about whether, like, who was the designer behind the BMW, 3 Series with from 2022. They don't care. It's a car. They want to know how it works. Where's the fault so they can repair it. That's all they care about. How it works. They don't need to know the design processes, the aesthetic ideas that came into the don't care. It's the car's here. How does it work? I need to do work on it, right? Or I need to run with this car. I need to operate it. So that's pretty much what most physicists, kind of they're thinking. But some, obviously, which are metaphysical naturalists, like to adopt all these theories. And of course, people like to speculate. People like to imagine. It's a common human trait that they want an explanation behind what they're observing. They want some kind of model. So I think I presume that theist, which Piers Morgan was engaging in this previous interview, was saying, is that there's the big question as to why are the things the way they are and not a different way. Why they even exist in the first place? That's the question that everyone really wants to get to, even the metaphysical naturalist. They just don't want to let go of insisting that there's still physical material processes behind the physical material processes that we see. So I mean, so in essence, and I obviously, because I did watch this video before, our reaction. Of course, predictably, but you didn't need to watch this to know this. Rich Dawkins is going to employ the same. He's going to insist that everything is still explainable within naturalist causes, and you don't need to go beyond. But he doesn't provide a reason why you shouldn't go beyond. Why you could, if you can speculate as a metaphysical naturalist about multiple universes, why can't you then at least quote unquote be allowed to have your speculation equally respected? To say that there is a creator that created everything.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a really comprehensive way of answering that. And going back to something that you just mentioned, there can't be a materialistic explanation for all of space, time, and matter. It's a very simple point, but it just seems to evade the naturalists. So we'll see what Dawkins has to say to this.
Richard Dawkins, this is the nub of, I think, my whole issue with your position on this. And you can respond, obviously, to what you just heard in a moment. But given your new book is about the genetic book of the dead, and it effectively takes us from here to in perpetuity on a genetic trail where each part of existence feeds the next and so on. And I totally subscribe to that. The genome of every body and every organization and so on creates, as you say, a comprehensive dossier on all the world as it moves forward. I get it. But when you go back to the very start, what is there before that? And that, I think I asked you last time, and Professor Meyer brought that up again as being the flaw in your position, which is what is there before it starts? What is nothing?
This is a question for a physicist, not a biologist, but what I would answer to Professor Meyer is that we need to explain complexity in terms of simplicity. And of course, it's true that I cannot say what was there before the Big Bang. Physicists sometimes tell us that the word before doesn't even mean anything before the Big Bang. But whatever it was, it
has to, doesn't it?
You cannot suddenly invoke.
Doesn't it have to? I mean, someone as logical as you are, I believe you are, you think about this all very logically. A logical mind surely has to appreciate that before the Big Bang, there has to have been something before then. Otherwise, what is nothing?
A physicist will tell you that
but what do you tell me?
I'm trying to tell you what a physicist would say, first of all. They would say that you cannot use the word before for the Big Bang. Time began at the Big Bang. There was no before the Big Bang. I know it's contrary to common sense. Physicists don't necessarily deal with common sense.
Well,
I'm sure you've heard this many times, Abdullah. So how would you respond to that?
I mean, he's generalizing on physicists. Physicists there are physicists who talk about oscillating universe theory, as I mentioned before. There was a previous universe, so that previous, prior, before, they use those terms, right? They say before, yes, our time and space started now, but there was a time and space or something equivalent to it in a previous universe, right? Which started and ended space-time, and then our one began after that. There's also the idea that there was, before this universe, before the Big Bang, there was a quantum nucleation event, which is basically, to explain what that meant, is that they say that behind everything there is a kind of quantum foam of energy appearing, or like almost like a quantum sea that's bubbling of energy, and these things fluctuate every point in time and space, and presumably beyond it has fluctuating energy. And a very rare occurrence occurs where a certain fluctuation occurs, which is so high enough in energy that it breaks a certain barrier, a certain energy barrier. And once it can do that, this is a quantum nucleation. It creates, you could say, the beginnings of the Big Bang. Not in a singularity entirely, but basically something that is you could say, small little egg, or cosmic egg, as the Hindus would call it, that begins a large, the big expansion of space and time. Space and time begins at that point. So these quantum fluctuations presumably happen before the universe existed, so before time and space. So then that was the before, because where are the fluctuations occurring then? What's going on with those fluctuations? So now, yes, we have evidence for quantum fluctuations, obviously within the universe, and that's quite fascinating. I've often noted that actually many people believed, both ancient Greek philosophers, different religions, and including the Abrahamic ones, that there was a type of description of a sea that exists upon which the heavens and the earth are founded upon, right? But the sea is not described as to what it is. Although the Bible says it's water, the Quran doesn't mention that it's actually it's metaphysical, like literal water, but it does say waters, right? So it's very fascinating. Allahu Alam, obviously this is now our speculation into it, and to obviously religious text, but that there is these quantum fluctuations that are within the universe is something which, yeah, that's fine. But then the physicists do say that this quantum fluctuations are existed before the universe in a grander, big, a larger field of these quantum fluctuations, and our universe could have been started by a very rare quantum fluctuation.
Yeah.
So that means they existed before this universe. So there was a before. So for Rich Dawkins to come and say before, now if I didn't know better, it sounds like he just read one book, popular science book by a fellow atheist who does physics, and then like maybe Lawrence Krauss or something, and then just ran.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
And then just said, all physicists,
Yeah.
every single one, no, where'd you get this from? Because there are so many theories about what happened before, with the word before, this universe. But they might say that within this universe, before the Big Bang, might not make sense. And even then, and obviously, do stop me from being pedantic, but I'm quite the pedant. I have an attention to detail, and details matter, because details are where the truth lies. That what we have is, we don't have a physics model. We don't have a time machine to see what happened at the Big Bang. But all we actually have is an understanding of physics, how things work, and then what we did is we did a mental model, and we just rewound the clock back in a simulation, so to speak, where we worked out what is the smallest, so that the universe expanded. All right, we can see that. So going down to smaller and denser and denser and denser and smaller, all the way back near time equals zero. What was the universe looking like? But beyond a certain amount, beyond Planck time and Planck space, the smallest amount of time and the smallest amount of space that we can measure. Sorry, not measure, but we can, that our equations can go down to, and then but beyond that, the equations don't work anymore, basically. So we get to a really small point, really tiny small point, and a very tiny small amount of time having already passed. That's about as much as our mental simulations, you could say, and maybe computer simulation, can go back to. Everything beyond that point, beyond the first quantum, beyond the first Planck time moment and Planck space moment, a Planck space area, before that and smaller than that, we don't know what happened. Have no idea. It's now the realm of speculation. So we can't go back to time zero. All we can go back to is just very soon, a certain size of the universe and a very short moment into the existence of the universe, but not before that. So Richard Dawkins now, obviously, he's not a physicist. He doesn't know about physics. I know, we all know about as much physics as he could access, because that's not his specialism. And so he's a layman like all of us, and yet he's making these pronouncements based on one book by one overconfident naturalist who practices physics.
Yeah, that's one thing I noted as well, Abdullah, that he seems to be pushing one narrative. Wherever he got it from, it just seems to be one narrative, but also that he refers to physicists, but he doesn't refer to philosophers, when in actual fact, at this moment, you would need somebody with a philosophy degree, potentially, or a philosophy background, at least a strong one, because, when it comes down to the beginning of the universe, this is where we can say physics and philosophy sort of merge. If we have someone with a background like Kuhn, where they have a physics and a philosophy background, they could speak about space, because even how do you define space? Is that really a physical question, or is that a philosophical question? But Dawkins doesn't want to go down that route, because it'll undermine his scientism. It'll undermine his view that, these navel-gazing armchair philosophers can't really achieve much, and nor can they tell us much about the beginning of the universe. Something else which I thought I might get your perspective on is, well, if things are this unclear at the beginning of the universe, then why is he so categorical about there being no God? Why isn't he more nuanced, and why isn't he more held back in his beliefs? Why doesn't he have that epistemic humility to say, well, do you know what? If our brains cannot comprehend the beginning of the universe, how can we be sure about the beginning of life, or the mind-body problem? But what I find with him and in his writings, he wants to be very categorical. So if we go back to the God delusion, he's very categorical. There most probably isn't a God because of these reasons. He infers from biology, and the argument against design infers it onto the universe. When it comes to the mind and the body, according to him, is very clear. Genes created us mind and body. He simplifies everything. When it comes down to the nitty-gritty, like you said, the details, which we should be pedantic about, because that's where the truth lies, he doesn't have much to say. And in your case, at least, you can at least put forward, well, here's a bunch of views that physicists have. But I found that he runs out of fuel very quickly when you ask questions which go back to areas which he should know about, because he wants to speak on behalf of atheism.
Yes, yeah. To just really, I really find myself, when speaking about these subjects, demystifying physics for everybody, to prevent the atheists from hiding in ambiguities. Where people don't understand what's going on in physics, the atheists will hide in those ambiguities and say, oh, well, because of things you can't understand, trust me, bro. We don't need God to explain everything in the universe. And I say, well, look, physics is about, really breaking it down, it's simply about movement, the movement of things. Why we need what you call metaphysics, or about physics, right? This is what metaphysics is. It means about physics. And why, obviously, naturalists hate metaphysics. Many of them do, some of them not necessarily. Some might embrace it as long as there's no God in there. But why they might hate metaphysics is because it really shows that physics is incapable of showing one thing, and that is, it can explain movement, velocity, acceleration of an oscillation of waves on the most subatomic particles, how things move in space and time. Great. But what ultimately is the things that are doing the moving? What is energy? Doesn't know. There's no further explanation. We can just explain what moves. You can only explain an atom by the fact that you say, well, there are things inside of that move around in certain patterns. There's the nucleus of the proton or neutron, and then there's the electrons that spin in these different energy shells and so on. Okay, or in orbits. Great. Okay, but now that you've explained the atom by explaining the movement of things inside. Okay, great. Now let's zoom in. What's the proton? What's the neutron? What's the electron? And so on and so forth. And it gets to a point where, as I said, because physics can only produce explanations about motions, it can't ultimately explain what is ultimately everything made out of. Like ultimately, there's like an infinite regress. This is made of small stuff, small stuff, small stuff, small stuff, small stuff, small stuff. Smaller what, right? And this is the insufficiency behind matter, right? I often say that the atheist's worldview lacks substance, literally, right? It can't explain substance, right? Because you've heard of Zeno's paradoxes. Everyone's heard of the famous philosopher, Zeno's paradoxes, right? Zeno, the philosopher Zeno, was actually trying to show that reality doesn't make sense, but he didn't believe in God. So his conclusion was that what you see doesn't make sense because any object you can be presented in front of you, I can cut it in half, quarter, 1/8, and so on, and I can do it ad infinitum. Like I can just keep cutting, even theoretically. Even if I can't physically cut it, but I can theoretically imagine what's halfway between that. So there's this side and that side. So this side, left side, is always different from the right side, and then I can cut. So ultimately, if you can conceptually do that, ultimately, and you can divide anything that has a spatial extent in space into two halves, into left and right, at least the left side and the right side, right? And the left side isn't the right side, and the right side is not the left side. Okay, then what is it made out of then? Because I can still cut it, and ultimately it creates an infinite regress of smaller and smaller things, where you will go on forever without providing an explanation if you rely purely on a material universe, right? Yeah. The matter is made up of smaller matter, but infinite regress, as you know, is a contradiction because ultimately it doesn't give an answer as to there is no substance. So I can have an infinite amount of smaller and smaller no substances, but isn't that the same as saying nothing, right? So then what is objects? What are extension? What is space? An extension of then? What is the ultimate explanation of this? And as a theist, we could posit that, well, look, there's only one explanation left, which is that everything that exists is ultimately, quote unquote, made out of the sustaining power of the creator of the universe. The creator of the universe, he extends things into existence, he extends it and he sustains it. And ultimately, all things require his sustaining. And the same thing with time. You go back to point zero time is actually zero space, because space and time are the same, are linked, connected. So at time zero, there's no space. So then there's absolutely nothing there. You can't have energy, matter without space or time. So at t equals zero, time equals zero, there's naturally zero of anything. So then how does something come from nothing then? Where does the first change come from? Well, again, as a theist, I can explain that, which is there's only one possible explanation left. There's no other explanation because that doesn't produce an infinite regress. You can't have an infinite regress of moments of time. We have to wait for until getting to now, right? Because if I had to wait for an infinite amount of time to finish, to get to now, we'd never reach to this point in time, right? So again, as a theist, I could say there was a bit starting point, and it was started by something that is not changing, but initiates change. And of course, then why does it initiate change, or how does it initiate change? How can something unchanging initiate change? You say, well, the only explanation again is that then it wills the change to happen, right? Mm-hmm. So because will indicates will is simply the thing initiating something out of choice, not out of compulsion by something making it mindlessly making it do things, right? So it's not mindlessly doing things like a machine, but because then that would be, again, then what is making the machine compel them, and what's making that, again, infinite regress. So the only The only way out of infinite regresses, to prevent an infinite regress, which is a contradiction, is that there was a creative universe who initiated everything into existence. So he created the first change, i.e. what you call time. And he extended into existence. He created extension, right? So he creates space. So he creates space and time, and he's still sustaining space and time, which cannot continue to exist without his, because its very substance, quote unquote, is formed of his sustaining powers, i.e. he sustains it. So that's why this, it's not the best explanation, it's the only explanation. Well, I suppose it makes it the best one, but it's not the best of many possible ones, it's the only explanation.
It's the only game in town. You know, it's like what Dawkins says about evolution, essentially. So one of the things that we would expect of him is, if you're going to put yourself forward as an atheist spokesman, then you should be able to articulate a case for atheism, not just refer to unknown physicists and say, well, they sort of know what they're talking about. Well, no, actually, you're the one that's been writing about physics. You're the one that's been making the case that, you know, essentially theism is dying in the realm of science. Well, then you should be able to at least open your mouth and speak for 5 minutes on where did it all begin from. At least give your musings, at least give an answer. But I think one thing which I think viewers found surprising is that when he goes off script, when there are things that he hasn't prepared for, he doesn't actually know what to say. And that shows that he's just not a critical thinker. So let's watch it a little bit more and see what else he says.
It makes no sense, does it? And that's what I mean. I think you're a logical man. That cannot make sense to you. The idea that you're not even allowed to use the word before the Big Bang, when every part of both of our brains tells us that that's obviously nonsensical, doesn't that make you think again?
We are not physicists. I, like you, am completely baffled by what physicists say to me, which is that you cannot use the word before for before the Big Bang. Time itself began at the Big Bang. Now that is totally counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive to me. It's counterintuitive to you. It's counterintuitive to Stephen Meyer. But we are not physicists, and you need to talk to a physicist. Talk to a physicist about that. And they will tell you that you cannot use the word before for the Big Bang.
Yeah, but you think that's as preposterous as I do.
I do, because I'm not a physicist.
You've just written a book as a biologist called The Genetic Book of the Dead, in which you talk about the body and the genome, comprehensive dossiers, and so on. So you're prepared to expound a philosophy based on that.
Sorry?
Yeah, just before he gets into that now, because I see that Piers is now veering into the area of biology here, and the Piers one hasn't been resolved. And Piers clearly doesn't understand how to address these subjects or to engage in the subject. The usual analogy I hear atheists use is, they say, asking what's before the Big Bang is like asking what's north of the North Pole, right? Yeah. So you go to the North Pole, and like anywhere you turn is somewhere that's not north anymore. So there's nothing north of the North Pole. It's a meaningless question. And I often say that, well, if you're talking about a coordinate in space and time, meaning before this moment in space and time, well, yes, I see your point. But there is a before, i.e., when there was no space and time, what was going on? And I use the analogy, and I could say my counter to that analogy is, there is actually something that's, you could say, quote unquote, technically north of the North Pole in a different dimension. That is in the third dimension, because if you look at the North Pole, it's just, in 2 dimensions. The third, it is more or less the North Star, right? It's right up, it's right on top of well, not perfectly so, but it's on top of the North Pole. All right, so in terms of the orientation of the Earth towards the North Star, Ursa Minor. The constellation Ursa Minor. So there could be quote unquote coordinates, as I said, or a before in a different dimension beyond the dimension that was just being created by the Big Bang, the dimensions that are created by the Big Bang, which is simply a before. I mean, simply put, there before space and time, there was a before. But if you mean before as in a before as a coordinate within space and time, yeah, sure, there was no coordinates in space and time before space and time. Yes, because there's no space and time. It's like if I'm making a map, but before I've made the map, and you say, which part of the map you're looking at, I'm saying, well, I'm not looking at any part of the map because I haven't made the map yet. But there was a before the map, right? There was before I made that map. So as I said, physicists use the word before all the time. They just say that not in the sense of a before within space and time, but as a before, as in when there was no space and time, what was there, or what was happening. They say that all the time. So it's false. And then he hides behind the argument that your limited human mind can't understand. It's a mystery. It's a mystery argument. It's a mystery to only the high priest or some allotted high priests of physics who happen to be atheists. Only they can understand. But everybody else can't understand, with their primitive minds, can't understand this. And the Piers Morgan argument that goes against intuition is the wrong thing to argue, because what many atheists have argued is that they'll say that human intuition, what you call common sense, right, doesn't seem to predict things that we've encountered in physics, but before. And I don't want to go into it because obviously this is a long discussion on this. When this was usually referred to when people discovered that the quantum world doesn't behave like the Newtonian model. The Newtonian model was like, snooker balls. Everything is a particle flowing, shooting around and they maintain a universal constant speed unless they're accelerated, and they could be accelerated forever and ever to a larger number of speed, and it's almost infinite, right? You could do it up to infinity. That was the Newtonian model. Then obviously you have relativity, and quantum mechanics comes along with that. Well, actually things are more like waves, and in relativity, the argument was the faster you go, the more energy is required to accelerate you, and the slower time occurs for you. Whereas in the Newtonian model, time was like universal for everyone. Everyone was in the same time frame, or what have you. Now, because the how physics worked was different from Newtonian physics, people say, it's not intuitive anymore. That's not intuitive. I say, no. Human intuition has not been wrong on this. It's the assumption that you thought that Newtonian physics was the only possible explanation for physics. All that showed was that the Newtonian model doesn't work at very fast speeds and at very small scales, and ultimately, which technically means it doesn't work at all. It's actually completely false, but it's useful for certain levels of speed and certain scales. It's useful to help simplify our equations. So that's what's really going. Human intuition has never been wrong about things, because mathematics is based on the intuition we use concerning numbers, or just basically rationalizing with numbers, with quantities. So it's not wrong. It's our assumptions when we fail to use rational thinking. That's when we bring assumptions into what we're looking at, like atheists, many of them tend to do. That's where we get proven wrong by the physics. Einstein wanted to believe that the universe had no beginning, and so was always the same as it was. It was in a steady state. He believed in a steady state theory. His atheism wanted him to believe that, and that's what he was pushing for. To the point that the term Big Bang was actually a derogatory term used against the expansionist model. Right? It was a derogatory. What you believe is Big Bang, but then it turned out that the universe does appear to be expanding. Space does appear to be extending. What's going on? Big surprise. Because it didn't show that intuition was wrong. It showed that these atheists' assumptions was wrong. And ironically, it was a theist who proposed the expansion of the universe, Georges Lemaitre, who was actually also a Belgic priest, a priest in Belgium, and a physicist. So he was right, and Einstein, the atheist, was wrong. So the theist actually produced the correct hypothesis, and the atheist made a mistake. So this is false. Human intuition is not a battle between human intuition and physics. It's a battle between assumption and rationalizing correctly without assumptions, using mathematics and using our correct intuition that contradictions are impossible, right? Yeah. And that's why we infinite regress in time and infinite regress in substance. That's why we believe in God's existence, because we reject contradictions.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to make, Otherwise, we can't make sense of science, and we can't even have a rational conversation after that. Another thing I wanted to just remind the viewers of is the way that Dawkins is, if for the lack of a better word, stonewalling the conversation by saying, well, it doesn't make sense to me because, physicists speak about before, it's incomprehensible to me. Well, why didn't he say similar things about Lawrence Krauss's book? Because there's lots of things in there in which he is doing bad philosophy. In fact, some things which are just plainly incoherent. So you find him traveling to different parts of the world. They had the unbelievers sort of narrative. They were going around, the physicists and the biologists, talking about why there's no God. So he doesn't give the same level of skepticism to his friend Krauss. But when it comes to these basic questions, he wants to stonewall the conversation because he doesn't have much to say.
Yeah. Oh no, definitely.
So
It's interesting. It's just deferring to authority, that we must believe what this human authority has said and do not
Yes.
question it, because your mind cannot fully understand these mysteries. That sounds a lot like blind faith in the priesthood. Why not say the mathematics says this? Because he doesn't look at the mathematics. He doesn't look at the evidence. He just takes it on authority, of a human authority, presumably one or two books he's read, and that's it. He just goes with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And now we're going to move on to the biology part. I wanted your feedback as well on this because, some of these things are philosophical more than scientific. So one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the Genetic Book of the Dead actually has a chapter dedicated to Dawkins' response to a debate that he had 2 years ago on the internet, which is all over the internet, that he lost. And that was actually a debate with Dennis Noble. And Dennis Noble is a professor at Oxford who's a systems biologist. He, again, like Dawkins, is not a believer in any way, shape, or form. However, their essential debate boiled down to reductionism as a ontology versus holism. And reductive ontology, which the selfish gene is a child of, is something that Dawkins has championed for decades. So one of the things that is interesting about this book, and I pre-ordered this, and I'm looking forward to when this comes out so I can actually read what he says, it's actually a face-saving strategy as well, because for the last 2 years, Dennis Noble has gone on every channel that he could on the internet and been interviewed by many different institutes and many different personalities, speaking about the debate and how he actually did, and how Dawkins couldn't answer his contentions, and Dawkins didn't really know what's going on, and he's out of date, and his own research in terms of the human heart and other things that he's been involved in decisively challenges the selfish gene concept. And Dawkins has been dead silent for the last 2 years. So that's just something interesting about the book that I think a lot of people don't know. So when it does come out, do look out for that chapter.
Oh, interesting.
So you're prepared to expound a philosophy based on that as a biologist, which I completely respect, and it makes perfect sense. The book makes perfect sense the way that you have written it. But why would you then think that a physicist cannot be contradicted just simply because they're a physicist? I can contradict what you say as a biologist.
No, you really aren't getting it. I'm so sorry. Modern physics is exceedingly mysterious. It really is. I mean, have you tried to read some of the difficult modern physics books? It really is very difficult to understand, and intuition doesn't do it. You cannot use human intuition. Human intuition was built up by evolution over many millions of years to survive on the African plain, hunting and gathering, looking for water holes, looking for mates, and so on. Our brains were not built to understand the profundities of the origin of the universe, the end of the universe, the kind of things that physicists deal with. I think it's actually amazing that at least some human brains are capable of dealing with this kind of stuff. My brain isn't, and nor is yours.
No, but that.
Okay, so I think some things can be said about what he's saying about human intuition and how it's an evolved faculty. The first thing is, when it comes to the evolution of the mind, of the brain, of our faculties, there was a massive dispute between the two founders of the theory of natural selection. Now, a lot of people don't actually know that natural selection as a theory wasn't just Darwin's idea. If you pick up any Victorian book on the topic, you will see it says Darwin and Wallace's theory, Darwin and Wallace's theory. You'll always see Darwin and Wallace. So who was Alfred Russel Wallace? He was a younger contemporary of Darwin who independently came up with the theory of natural selection. They both decided to publish it together. However, Wallace jumped off the bandwagon because he started questioning the ability of natural selection to produce the human mind. A lot of people don't realize that there's a history to this, which is why he was whitewashed from the scientific books. What basically happened was he realized these people that were considered to be savages at the time, if they were brought to the UK, to Victorian England, and if they studied in Cambridge, they would be able to produce scientific literature and come up with scientific arguments and do everything that a simple European person could do. And that didn't make sense under the theory of natural selection, because you should only be able to have cognitive abilities according to your environment. And in the environment in Latin America, or wherever these people came from, you shouldn't have the faculties of such expanded thought like these people did. So he started doubting the theory of natural selection because of this. And Darwin actually said to him, "Don't murder our child." There's a really interesting book, In Darwin's Shadow by Michael Shermer. And he goes over some of these historical episodes. But long story short, even saying it's an evolved faculty does not allow him to say that we should not be able to reason about X, Y, and Z. Because what do you mean by evolved? If we mean by evolved that it's evolved to help us survive, but not to track truth, that's a particular view of evolution. That's not the only view. So there's lots of things that he should know better than to try and give these very simplistic answers just to win over Piers Morgan. Maybe he's doing it to win over him, or maybe he's doing it because he's simply unaware of these nuances.
Yes, I often thought that if our minds have been evolved to not understand reality as it really is, then we wouldn't be able to know that we don't understand reality as it really is, or we would not being able to apprehend things that don't make sense. We just encounter contradictory results in our experiments, and that's it. And then we wouldn't go any further than that. But the fact is that if some of us can understand it, then clearly the human mind has the capacity to understand it. So it's, unless he's saying that there are some humans that can understand it and have a gene that enables them to do so, and other humans that do not. But then I suppose that's probably what he's trying to intimate, is that some humans do have an aptitude for this, and everyone else doesn't have an aptitude for this. But then surely there must be a means, because we use language, for the humans that do understand to explain it to those of us who don't understand. In essence, the only thing that human, in my understanding, the only thing that human can't understand is contradiction. Right? We can understand everything else, but we can't understand contradiction. So we haven't encountered contradictions in observable, testable physics, but we have encountered contradictions in our attempted explanations of the universe, which are called paradoxes. Now, paradoxa, meaning that from doxa meaning our beliefs have conflicts in them, right? Which means there's a contradiction within our beliefs, i.e., we must be believing something, some assumptions there that are being disproved by reality, but we don't know where those assumptions are. But we only notice there's a problem because all our models appear to have a contradiction in it. And then what's always historically happened through centuries and centuries is we discover a better explanation that comes along and makes, that explains it. Oh, our models were wrong. There's a better model now that makes more sense. Now the contradiction has been resolved. That's always the case. But we've always been able to understand that. Just because physics appears to be very mysterious to the average layperson doesn't mean it's not understandable. Genetics appears to be mysterious to most people, but you can understand it if you just start reading the books and obviously you have the patience for it, then you can understand it. So I think he's actually he's quite literally insulting our intelligence. He's insulting human intelligence, or at least for most humans.
No, he is doing that. And as well as that, Abdullah, what he is doing is, because he cannot answer the very basic questions that Piers Morgan is asking, he's pressing the self-destruct button against reason and saying, well, we weren't evolved to have these type of conversations, Piers. Can we just move on? It's a very convenient answer, especially considering the fact that he's a biologist and Piers is not. So he can say anything, and someone like Piers can just accept it because he doesn't know any better.
Yeah, or perhaps he should say, look, Piers, I don't think you're a fool. I just think that you're not mentally evolved enough to understand the topics. Some people might be saying, I might actually agree with Richard Dawkins from that point, but anyway. No, like the human mind clearly has the capacity to model things. We build AI, we build computers that have the capacity and do have the capacity to model mathematics equations and make roughly accurate simulations of many things. Clearly we have the capacity to model spatial models, and models that involve quantities. Because we develop mathematics that is used to understand these things. We develop mathematics with our basic, simple minds, very primitive minds, as he's alleging. And these mathematics have always been proved to be quite consistent. Mathematics is quite consistent. And its predictions are quite accurate once we have the right model, a mathematical model. The mathematics has never been disproven. As in its basic fundamental core, the core points of mathematics, x equals x, for example, and so on. They've never been disproven. They've never been that reality is more complicated than you can imagine. Although there are some theories out there, spiritualist theories that that contradictions can be possible, and I've encountered atheists that argue that contradictions can be possible as well. How do you know they can't be possible? Their skepticism has been ratcheted up so much that they actually believe that even contradictions can be possible. We just haven't observed them yet, right? Or we just haven't been able to prove that that's not the case, and that's just ridiculous, right? That's just ridiculous, and that's the problem with both atheists and people who believe in the Trinity and who believe in polytheism. And as I famously said in my debate with alongside Mohammed Ajab against these two atheists, is that atheists and polytheists and others, they're all actually part of the same millah. They're all part of the same deen, and that belief, and that is that they believe that contradictions are possible, and that allows them to believe the wacky beliefs that they believe in, or to reject the only possible explanations behind things, is because they think that contradictions can be possible. Our minds are just not evolved enough, or more developed enough, or too fine limited enough to understand. No, contradictions are a contradiction of reality itself. It can't be. Reality can't be and not be at the same time. So this is why, as Muslims, and why theists pioneered, the modern physics, and the model of physics throughout centuries and centuries, was we rejected the idea of pagan polytheist idols, where each idol controls a part of reality, and it's very contradictory, and they fight each other, and so on and so forth. Whereas we saw an ordered universe, a unitary universe, a universe that had very fixed and consistent laws of physics, and this denoted a ultimate one single controller and determiner of all things. So it was theism as actually created civilization, made it possible, not the atheists. Atheists were always historically viewed to be backward to people who didn't have any beliefs, or they were in the same subset as the pagans, and a lot of Richard Dawkins' own refutation of things that involve gods are usually against polytheists. Right? He says, I don't believe, I reject that the universe is controlled by Odin and Freya and Agni and all these pagan idols, which each had a separate control over 7 parts of the universe. Because I'm a physicist, I believe there's a unitary, there's the laws of physics, and that is what dominates the universe. And so, okay, that's great, that you believe in a unitary thing, and you reject these pagan polytheists. But here's the point: is what established those laws of physics in the first place? The laws of physics are between quantities of things. What established that things would be ordered in such a way? You don't have an explanation, and of course, him and Lawrence Krauss said, "I don't care about the how. I don't care about the why. I only care about the how."
Yeah.
What are the laws of physics? I don't care who instituted the laws of physics.
Yeah. I think the how why sort of comment that they made at the time, it just goes to encapsulate their entire mindset. It's a selective type of skepticism. It's a selective type of reasoning that they have for the world. It's not a consistent one.
That's my point, though.
I wish it were.
Well, yeah, I wish both our brains could. But the truth is, it's because the human brain can't comprehend this, including, I don't think, any physicist. Because the moment they say you can't have before the Big Bang, they lose me completely just on a common sense perspective. It's that reason that I think there has to be a power that is greater than the human brain. And that gives me succor to my belief in God, and why I think people turn to gods of different types, obviously. They turn to that because it is incomprehensible otherwise what has happened here.
There has to be something more difficult to understand than the human brain can understand. I accept that. But it doesn't have to be God. It doesn't have to be the kind of God who, I don't know, forgives sins and listens to prayers and things like that. There is something very mysterious, and I don't understand it, and you don't understand it, and maybe we never will. I think it's not clear whether physicists understand it. Some do, some don't, but it's obviously going to be very mysterious. But God is not that interesting mystery. God is just a personification of human desires, a father figure, something like that, somebody who looks after you. You said at the beginning that it was comforting for you. God is somebody who listens to prayers, who forgives sins, who takes action for the benefit of humanity or not, as the case may be. We're not talking about that now. We're talking about deeply, deeply mysterious, profound things, which physics is working on, and it's very difficult to understand. And the fact that you don't understand it and I don't understand it is not good grounds for suddenly invoking a supernatural sky daddy.
Okay, so what's interesting is clearly we have to make a distinction between the argument for God and the argument for religion, right? But he wants to continuously just rubbish any inference that we're making for a supernatural entity, even though we haven't defined that this entity is the Abrahamic God, because he wants to bring in all those anthropomorphic elements. Oh, it's the sky daddy, or it's this, or it's that. Well, and he says there's nothing mysterious about it. Well, what about the Islamic concept of God, that God is not contained by space, time, matter? God is not within the six directions, as the Prophet, peace be upon him, told us, that, reflect deeply about creation, do not reflect about Allah, because you cannot, I'm just paraphrasing here, but someone can maybe post the narration in the comments, that you just have to believe in Allah, that it's that incomprehensible. The meaning of this narration is that you reflect deeply on creation, but the essence of God is beyond you. Look at the books of Aqidah that we have in Islam, such deep philosophical thought, such deep insight, stuff that, if Dawkins was to read that, I'm sure that he'd be reading, things about the origin of the universe and thinking, well, I can see these Islamic thinkers, these theologians, these philosophers, they have a very difficult time trying to grasp God. Well, obviously, because we don't hide behind that. We accept that. But what he wants to do is he just wants to make God into this very childish thing, so then he can knock it down. And you find this repeatedly with these atheists, that they want to anthropomorphize God.
Well, I mean, this is the thing, right? What's he actually saying? He's saying that I don't want to believe in God because God's not mysterious enough. The truth must be really mysterious. And so a God that answers your prayers and can interact with you personally, as in, listens to your prayers, answers your prayers, will judge you and so on, that and can send messages to mankind on a general level. in language that we can understand, oh no, that's too not so mysterious to us. So I don't like it. I want something that's really mysterious, that really fires my imagination. It's like that's not the criteria for truth. And secondly, as you pointed out correctly, the like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God is in terms of what He is, understanding Him for what He is, that's pretty mysterious. Something that is not limited, not limited or finite within time and space. He can create things from nothing. His will is not determined by emotions or mood that is genetically or predisposed him to do things. He can literally have free will. Nothing. He has no genetic requirement to do things. He's not emotionally pushed to do things. He's not compelled to do anything by any means whatsoever, of any means of determinism at all whatsoever. But he initiates from pure choice and will. I don't understand that. That's pretty mysterious to me. I can't understand how he is he's self-sustaining, because I'm a sustained creature. So it's hard for me to understand. I can reason that he must exist and he must be self-sustaining, but I can't comprehend being completely independent of all things, independent of anything else, not dependent on anything at all. I can't comprehend that. I can't comprehend making something from nothing. I can't comprehend having a real free will, not driven by my emotions or by my hormones. I can't comprehend that, not being driven by stimuli. I can't comprehend that. That is mysterious to me. But rationally, I know it is a necessity that he must exist as the explainer behind everything in this universe, the only possible one, right? So it goes pretty mysterious. I think it's more fascinating, actually, that there is this creator which has all these attributes which we can't fathom, we can't completely fathom, and yet can still relate to us, communicate to us via revelation, is deeply aware of you in particular, right? You're not so small that it's above his attention, right? It's like he's some great, you're swimming in an ocean, and a massive sea monster swims past you, doesn't see you because it's so big, right? It's like, well, the atheists imagine that something so big or great must be incapable of even noticing us. That's their assumption. They want this explanation a certain way. They say that we want to believe in a God, but not God as you understand it, but God as this very large, uncaring, but deeply mysterious thing that doesn't actually have a will in per se, but just does things, or what have you. And it's a mystery too. We want to keep it as a mystery. They still want this unexplainable mystery in their lives, and yet they decry theists when they cite the creator, who is what the creator is a very mysterious thing. Can't really fathom the true meaning of his attributes. But anyway, so this is the thing. This is the arrogance I find. I don't say it's for all atheists, because every atheist is different. But I would say that this sounds like arrogance from Richard Dawkins, that he wants an explanation that he likes, not actually what reality is. And reality doesn't necessarily agree with with what you want it to be, right? What was it? Facts don't care about your feelings. Yeah, I'm sorry, if you find that the creator that can actually communicate with you and yet is ineffable, like you can't understand truly what he is, but he can still communicate. That's not mysterious for you. Mystery must come in a box of not having anything to do with you, or like just not caring about you. Right? That's the mystery you kind of want. It's anyway. And I've also, a side point, Piers Morgan, I don't think he's doing a good job of arguing the case. He just says that I want to believe in God because he makes me feel better. Right? That's not a very good case to argue along those lines.
Yeah, it's not, and this is the sort of thing that he picks up on, because Piers Morgan was making some good points, but then he added a weak point to it, and then Dawkins took advantage of that. The narration I was referring to is reflect deeply upon the creation, but do not reflect upon the essence of the creator. Verily, his essence cannot be known other than to believe in it. And what's interesting about what Dawkins says in The God Delusion and elsewhere is, well, if we have something like the universe, and the universe needs to be explained, or something, say it starts off with biology, we need a simpler explanation. We need a simpler organism, going back to Luca, the last universal ancestor. So if there's a designer, the designer has to be simple. So he sometimes says things which are opposite to what he's saying here. And here he's saying, well, if God is comprehensible, then he's not interesting. What's I think overall what we can see here is, like Michael Roos says about him and about the God delusion, is he makes him embarrassed to be an atheist, because if you're going to put yourself forward as an atheist advocate, as the leading atheist in the world, then you should be able to have conversations, deep philosophical conversations, or at least even surface level conversations with a journalist. But you can see he's continuously stonewalling, he's continuously moving on. What we're going to see next is what he says from a biological perspective. But what I did want to highlight, Abdullah, is Dawkins actually refuses to engage with intelligent design proponents. Now, whether we agree with intelligent design or we don't, that's irrelevant to the discussion, because Dawkins will engage with journalists like Piers Morgan. He will engage with creationists in America. He will engage with Muslim school children in the UK. He will engage with uninformed, untrained people. But when it comes to professionals who are critical of him and who really come from a biological background like he does, then he refuses to engage with them. And the only engagement that we find between Stephen Meyer, who's basically the head of the intelligent design media narrative, and not only the media narrative, he's also the one of the big brains behind the Intelligent Design Project, and he's got a PhD in philosophy of science from Cambridge, so he's an academic in his own right. You know, the closest interaction you're going to find between Stephen Meyer and Dawkins is through the medium of Piers Morgan, that both of them appeared and they're making comments, reviewing each other's arguments.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think if you disagree with somebody and you want to do a public service to show how they're wrong, then engage them in a debate. You shouldn't be saying, "This is beneath me to do so." You know, like, engage in a debate. The people will benefit from that, especially when there's a large number of people that might follow Meyer. So it's actually quite, it's a little bit arrogant to do that. I believe in debates. That's why I've always been promoting doing debates, and you've done debates, and many of our colleagues have done debates, like Hamza and Hamjab, because we believe the best way to help educate the wider public is to bring on people we disagree with, in order to show the public why they are wrong, by giving them a fair platform and then having that discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if our genomes, if our genetic background has all the information which has led to us being what we are today, and that will obviously extrapolate as we go forward, then it does beg the question, doesn't it? Where does the original information come from?
Yes, it does. And as far as a biologist is concerned, we're talking about the original information coming at the origin of life. And that's something which biologists and chemists and physicists can deal with. But you've gone right back to the origin of the universe.
Okay, so before we look at the rest of his answer, I just want to highlight something to the viewers. One of the arguments that was happening between Dennis Noble, who, interestingly, Abdullah, was the doctoral examiner of Dawkins back in the 60s when he got his PhD. So he's actually a senior in age and in terms of academic rank to Dawkins, was that the genome doesn't actually have all the information to replicate itself or create mind bodies, because there's information outside of the genome, and the control and the control and the direction of causality is not from the genome to the cell, to the tissue, to the organ, to the body, to societies. It's actually a case where the organism has power over the genome. So even Dawkins answering the question of Piers Morgan shows that Piers Morgan is going by Dawkins' books, The Selfish Gene and obviously the Genetic Book of the Dead. However, they're both out of date, because for decades now, we've known that information is not just stored in the DNA, but there's vital information which is actually stored in even the membrane of the cell. And that information, as Dennis Noble calls it, has the conditional logic of life, the if, then, and, or, and all these types of codings which is needed for things to actually function. But going back to information, what we're going to see now is that they're going to be speaking about the origin of information. And one of the things that Dawkins said, well, physicists, biologists, and chemists, we're sorting it out. Well, actually, if we look at the field of what's known as biogenesis, it's not as neat as what he tries to portray it as. And it definitely is not as neat as what other Darwinists have tried to put forward. In fact, if anything, we are very far from an answer in terms of the origin of life and the origin of information. Yet again and again, we find the likes of Dawkins trying to make the argument that actually we're sorting it out, we're close, and we're nearly there.
Yeah, subhanAllah. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think Richard Dawkins is being epistemologically arrogant by making declarations about genetics when it's still a field of study that's producing new and more information. I remember, it's about just 2 decades ago, or a bit more. There was, epigenetics was discovered, where genes can be turned on and off, especially due to environmental factors, and that wasn't factored in to thinking before that. And then people often even denied it until we had evidence for that. And there's going to be more evidence coming across. I wish Richard Dawkins simply just said, look, I'm still studying genetics, and we're still, and maybe in a couple decades, maybe we'll bottom it out. But it's an interesting field of study. I'll wait until that point in time until we've bottomed out the whole subject. But he's not. He's making proclamations. Some of those proclamations are quite premature, and as you pointed out, also outdated.
So it's wonderful that you brought out the example of epigenetics, because it's something I didn't actually mention, and it came up in the debate with Dennis Noble. Dennis Noble pointed out that the discoveries in epigenetics challenges the central dogma of biology, which is you go from DNA to RNA to proteins and never the reverse. And the genome is sealed off from the outside world. So what's happening in the outside world has no impact. However, what Noble showed decisively in that debate is not only is Richard Dawkins out of date when it comes to molecular biology, but actually epigenetics is a live and thriving field in which we now have evidence that experiences and stresses that the body goes through, environmental changes, induces change at the genetic level. We have epigenetic markings, we have switches, we have all of these epigenetic processes which can generate an army of enzymes to go in and modify the genome. And in fact, what I found amazing, and I was just listening to this today, that Noble gives the example that during the coronavirus pandemic, our body was doing exactly what the selfish gene perspective tells us is impossible. The cell was signaling to the genome to increase the mutation rate in that part of the genome that produces the grabbing molecule, which can actually help us immunize ourselves against the likes of corona. So this is a directed mutation. This isn't a random mutation. And another thing which was really, really interesting, came up in the debate, is that most of the changes in the genome are not due to random mutations, because the cell has the ability to do proofreading and correct the copying errors. The exact opposite of what Dawkins has been saying for a very long time. However, I want you, Abdullah, to comment about this, that Dawkins is out of date for decades, yet he has put himself forward and made arguments against God based upon the reductive selfish gene perspective, and biologists have moved away from this, yet he is still the most well-known Darwinist in the world.
Yeah, I mean, well, I said I don't think I can add more to what you've said on the matter, which is that I think the real question is as to why he wants to produce an overarching explanation for human behavior, and if it's what is producing human behavior, what are we motivated by? And of course, he wants to argue that this is all just a haphazard circumstance, which there's no intention behind it. He wants to argue for an intentionless reality other than the gene trying to preserve itself. But if you have organisms which are created by genes, which are deliberately changing those genes to better preserve the organism, then which is being the selfish part? Because if all we are our genes and various other organic chemicals and molecules, but we are our genes, and yet the organism, which is a transient thing, because obviously what survives us is our genes, apart from obviously the matter that made us, and yet the organism can transcend the genes, i.e., by changing it or what have you, or switching it on and off. Then there's no more selfish gene anymore. So then what is motivating us anymore? There must be something higher than just simply genes, right? Now, some people might say just simply the survival of organisms, perhaps, but genes don't really intend anything. As I said, genes don't intend to preserve organisms. They just are as a chemical composition. That's all they are. But to argue that then, well, what is the purpose of life? I suppose this is where, and on a more fundamental, life itself, if it's not simply the preservation of genes, or then if genes are actually subservient to simply the needs of the organism, then what are organisms for in the first place? And of course, this is why he would defend his thesis so much. He desperately wants to say that, look, life's only purpose is to preserve genes, the genes that creates life. So, well, what if then the genes are not deemed to be necessary and they can be changed to serve just the continuation of organisms? What's going on? So now, again, some people might argue, and I can anticipate some atheists will say, surely this just simply means that things happen in the haphazard way, and the intentionality of organisms is just due to advanced equilibrium systems of equilibrium trying to balance themselves. And I obviously, as a debate, I always try to dissipate the opponent's arguments, what they will try to say. But Rich Dawkins is so as you pointed out, with Charles Darwin, when he said to his colleague who came up with the theory alongside him that don't kill our baby. I think with Rich Dawkins' baby is a selfish gene, and it was killed long ago. Some people say it died and still, it was still born. But he's desperately trying to preserve his baby, despite the fact that genetics has moved on far on.
Yeah, and I think the biggest problem, Abdullah, is not so much to do with a theory being wrong, but an ontology being wrong, because the selfish gene perspective was a bottom-up reductive theory. And when it comes to Noble's ideas, and one of the reasons why there's a lot of pushback is because he's asking for a holistic ontology of biology, which, by the way, just to be very, very clear, Richard Dawkins is not a believer in God, and nor is Dennis Noble. They both are away from that. But the implications of what Dennis Noble is saying can be used by intelligent design proponents, even though Dennis Noble is a critic of intelligent design proponents. But one of the things that you'll find on the internet is where Dennis Noble is complaining about the fact that this biological change in ontology, in the shift in thinking from reductionism to holism to the integrative approach, is being hindered by the Darwinists worried about the creationists getting more ammunition, right? So look, it's not just biology. There's ideology involved, even though both sides currently, in terms of the third way of evolution and Dennis Noble and James Shapiro and these guys, they're anti-intelligent design, and so is Dawkins. But the fact that science can go through such a radical change, and for decades, as Dawkins pointed out in the debate with Dennis Noble, that, well, if you're right, then me and the majority of the biological community has been wrong for decades, right? And Dennis Noble, agrees, well, that happened. And the problem with that is that it fits into a theistic narrative where science isn't the be all and end all. You can always have revisions, you can always have revolutions, and it breaks the the image of Dawkins as this pioneer for the self-regime perspective, because his theory just simply turns out to be wrong, and he's the one pony, and that's the only scientific theory that he's linked to.
Sure. I can perhaps propose, I think, ultimately what this is a battle between, and this is a battle between those who want to believe in accidental matter and those who see that matter is purposed, or purposed matter. And on both levels, like the universe is not an accident, it's not an accidental matter, it is purposed matter. It was brought about with intention. Purpose means that there's an intention behind it, a will. That's what it means. So whereas these philosophical naturalists want to believe that there is no will, no intent behind both the universe on a macro scale, and of course on a smaller particular scale, life on the third planet from a particular solar system. So they want to argue that life itself has no intent, and the universe itself also has no intent. But if you can argue that both the universe is intended to exist, you're probably aware of the anthropomorphic principle, that a universe that actually, when it was created and expanded at a rate that wasn't too fast, so that galaxies and matter and actual atoms couldn't form, but not too slow, such that it crumpled in on itself. So this perfect sweet spot of expansion, whereby it was just, and it's very narrow sweet spot. It's just right that, forget about life, but even atoms and molecules, and then galaxies can actually form, actually have the chance to form, then one of them could even sustain life in the first place. So this one has always been an issue. This is why atheists would jump to the multiverse theory. This is why they go to the multiverse theory, because they say it's very improbable. That means, they say, that there must have been, every other universe was tried in a random process, and we just happen to be in the random, in a statistical probable universe, which occurred. It was statistically probable because after infinite amount of universes are tried, it's going to be a guaranteed certainty that there will be a universe that fits this improbable set of constants, universal constants in it, which allows for the expansion rate to be just right for that atoms can actually form, and then eventually planets, galaxies, stars, and so on and so forth. So that they jump to this, this is a speculation that has no evidence anywhere. This is them plucking something like from Greek mythology almost, just plucking it and say, this must be the case because I don't want to accept the alternative. I just don't want to accept the alternative, that the reason why you have a universe that actually even allows even atoms to form in the first place, that will then begin to create planets and stars and so on, is because it was chosen to be. The laws of physics were chosen to be that way and not a different way, for example. And the same thing with, and it's the same thing with other laws of physics, whereby it is about that life does seem to be intentional. Now, how that comes about is an interesting question, but life does seem to be intentional.
Yeah, and then they come up with that super brain. I just lost Abdullah. Have I lost Abdullah or lost? Can you say what? Press 1 if you can see me, guys. I'm trying to understand. Was it me or Abdullah? Press, if you can press 1 so you can hear me. There he is.
Hello?
Yes, I can see
sorry,
you.
I just cut off again. Sorry, I don't know what.
No,
So
that's fine.
The internet was playing up, maybe.
Yeah, that's fine. I was just keying off your point that after all of that narrative, after espousing all of that narrative, then the atheists would come up with the most enlightening thought that their brains can generate, which is, well, we shouldn't be surprised that we're alive, because if we weren't alive, if we weren't in a universe that allowed life, we wouldn't be surprised to be in it. So why are we surprised in the first place? So ultimately, it's about anything but God. Anything but God. We will go for anything, no matter how ludicrous, no matter how counterintuitive. And it just goes back to what Richard Lewontin said about the way that science operates, that we have to go with the naturalistic explanation, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated, because naturalism is the absolute. They cannot allow any divinity through the door. So ultimately, naturalism is a presupposition of science. It's not a conclusion, but we're often given it as a conclusion, and that leads to these sort of absurd conversations. So let's play some more and see what they're talking about.
To the Big Bang, which is another matter entirely, and which is not really relevant to the biological question of what happens once biology gets started, which is the origin of genetics, actually. It's the origin of the information which is passed from generation to generation, from living creature to living creature. That started maybe 3.8, maybe 4 billion years ago. The universe started more like 13.8 billion years ago, which is a much longer time ago, and which is a totally different question, nothing to do with biology.
But doesn't code have to have a coder?
No, of course it doesn't. Code arises spontaneously at the origin of life, something very, very simple, probably.
Okay, so I'm going to have to just replay that section because I want everybody to concentrate on what you're saying. It's actually going to give a lot away.
Arises spontaneously at the origin of life, something very, very simple, probably, at the origin of life, which was not genetic, not DNA at least. It would have been some kind of genetic, some kind of coding, which would be a self-replicating molecule. Once you get a self-replicating molecule, then you have the possibility of mutation, which is mistaken encoding.
Okay, so I just want to highlight a few things about this. The first thing is he's giving a categorical answer. Of course, a code doesn't need a coder. How does he know that? He literally has zero evidence for that. And then he says it's something simple, probably. And the reason why he's saying it's something simple is from a naturalistic perspective. They try to break down complex things into simple things because that is the reductive ontology. They have to take complex things into simple things. Well, he should have learned his lesson 2 years ago when Dennis Noble wiped the floor with him, that you can't stick to reductivism in biology. Things are holistic. We don't just have genomes leading to bodies. Genes didn't create us mind and body. It's not that the ultimate preservation, the ultimate purpose of life is the preservation of our genes, because genes in of themselves can't do anything. I mean, I'll give a very simple example, Abdullah, that Dennis Noble used. And it's actually an example which Dawkins was using, but then Noble challenged him on it. And what Dawkins basically said is, well, Dennis, what we could do is we could take the ATGC coding of your genome and we could write it on granite and leave it for 10,000 years. And after 10,000 years, we can create a identical twin of yourself. And Dennis Noble said, well, you can't. And the reason is very, very simple, because the DNA is not a self-replicator. You need the cell, and the cell has information in the membrane, which is the conditional logic of life, which is the controls of life, which allows the DNA to be read. So the DNA is a template. It's not a book of life. It's not a code of life. It's a template, and that template cannot do anything until and unless the cell initiates the change. So holism makes more sense than reductivism. But here, again, what's he's doing? He's saying, well, going back 3.8 billion years ago, there must have been one cell. Why one cell? And that must have been something simple, and it must have been a self-replicating molecule. And the changes are only through accidents. Again, he's repeating the Darwinian mantra without any evidence. There's literally no evidence for what he's saying, especially him categorically saying a code doesn't need to come through a coder. Again, zero evidence for that. And he's replaced argumentation with basic assertion.
Yeah. Now, of course, like as I said, I looked into this matter, and this is called the problem of abiogenesis, which is, where did life come from? The first replicating cell, the first replicating protein. Where did it come from? I mean, the protein is extremely unlikely to occur naturally. It's actually quite unstable. It needs to all the complex amino acids that form the protein are very unstable. They have to all kind of exist at the same time to then make the first protein. And it's you get simple amino acids, but the kind of complex ones that form proteins is very, very hard to occur. So this is the problem made by biogenesis, and obviously atheist geneticists are trying to crack it by trying to find some natural process that produces it. Now, I was thinking about this, of course, as a Muslim, we're not theologically compelled to believe that the smallest amount of life was produced by a quote unquote bona fide miracle, but could have been part of the natural process of the universe, willed by the creator, because everything that happens in the universe is willed by the creator of the universe. Everything is his will, and everything was intended to be deliberate the way it was, including that. So if abiogenesis did occur, that would be the will of the creator. We're not compelled to believe that abiogenesis didn't occur, and that it was done by a direct miracle. However, it's a very interesting question, right? Because it does seem very extremely unlikely, and life is different. I mean, we're made out of the same atoms, molecules as well. We're same atoms anyway, building blocks and quantum particles, as everything else in this universe. But our arrangement of particles is very different from the arrangement of particles in rocks, mountains, planets, and stars. We are an arrangement that wants to preserve its arrangement in some way, not an exact arrange, but preserve it, a similar arrangement, and make maybe slight changes over time. But that's quite fascinating to have an arrangement of matter that's proactively trying to preserve its arrangement, right? Which is what life, you could say, is. So it's proactive. We're proactive matter, and that's quite fascinating. And that does, make us different from inanimate matter in the universe. So it's a big question. It's quite fascinating. But as I said, the onus for us, it doesn't matter how this question's answered. Does abiogenesis occur naturally, or does it require supernatural effort? For us, it would not affect our theology either way, because we're not compelled to believe either way. They both would be explained from within the worldview that's been revealed to us. However, the atheist is desperate to argue that abiogenesis is possible, that life can come from non-life, from unorganized matter, from purposeless and unpurposed matter. They're desperate. They've put all their chips, to use a poker term or a gambling term, they've put all their gambling chips at the casino. They've put it on this bet. So they are the ones who are going into science, desperate to get a certain outcome in the science, which brings the question: can they then be unbiased? Right? For us, it doesn't matter. Okay, we just sit back, do the science and see where it leads us. Who care? We don't care where it goes, as long as we can see the evidence and let the science take us where it will. But they are desperate. It has to be a certain way. The science results must produce a naturalistic explanation. It must be completely naturally explained. Otherwise, they're going to let God back in, and they don't want to do that. That's what I say. They're not even. I would respect more an agnostic. An agnostic would say God could be possible. I just haven't seen enough evidence that compels me just yet. But I'm going to leave the door open for that, and I'm going to say that God is possible as the explanation behind many things. I just want more evidence. So I'm only an agnostic because I'm ignorant. I would respect that. But an atheist, and I know that Richard Dawkins technically did say once that he does believe that it is possible God could exist, but it's unlikely. I don't know why it's unlikely. That itself is asserting something. He could have simply said, God could exist. I'm ignorant. I'm awaiting further evidence. Maybe that's the case. Maybe not. I want to see more evidence. But he's just making these assertions, and he's staking his claim on both biology and physics, that the world is a certain way, despite the fact that we don't know enough about genetics to make those claims, and we don't know anything. We don't know enough about at least physics. Metaphysics aside, but physics would never be able to give us the answer anyway. It's impossible for physics to give us an answer whether there's a God exists or not. It's virtually impossible, because physics can only explain what's within itself. That's the limitation of physics. That's the point of it. Is it just explains how it works. A mechanic can look at a car, would know nothing about the designer, would know nothing about how it was designed and which factory it comes from. The mechanic wouldn't know, right? The mechanic just looks at the thing that's been made. So that's the problem. That's the non-neutrality of atheists, and that's why, that's why I kind of lose respect for someone that argues, as Richard Dawkins argues. He doesn't have certainty, and yet he makes claims and evidence with such bold confidence.
Absolutely. And I love the fact that you highlighted we don't have a particular perspective we need to defend. So Allah is behind every movement in the universe. Whatever happened at the beginning, they have some sort of model. Well, Allah has agreed those things, so that fits with us. If they have some a biogenesis model which works, we can accept that. But what is strange is that they are not consistent with their own metaphysics. Well, I'm not even sure if he even accepts he has a metaphysics, but from his perspective, he is looking to his creator, which is randomness. But randomness does not actually exist. Randomness is just a placeholder term for your ignorance. So the way that biologists normally define randomness is, well, the mutation, the copying error is random in respect to fitness because it may be beneficial or may be detrimental to the organism. That's irrelevant. We know that that is determined. If we have all the environmental conditions prior to the copying error, we can predict what the copying error actually is. So it's not actually a copying error. Yet we find they don't iron out, Abdullah, their own metaphysics when it comes to evolution, because many a time they will say, well, like Stephen Jay Gould said, back in the day we had the VHS tapes, right? So he said, well, if we could do this by hand, we could rewind the tape, or we could put it in the tape recorder and rewind, and you replay it, it's the same movie again. He said evolution doesn't work like that because of randomness, and natural selection is a fixed factor, but randomness is not. So if you rewind the tape of evolution and you replay it from the origin of life to now, we will have totally different creatures to what we have now. We'll have totally different morality and all of this stuff. How can he say that? Clearly he's a very intelligent man. He's a very intelligent biologist. He wrote famously The Structure of Evolutionary Thought, a textbook for the biological community even today. Yet it's a very basic point. If you rewind and replay from the origin of life, you get the same outcome. It will not be a different outcome.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right. It's that randomness doesn't exist in the way that atheists argue. Randomness is a human word given to situations which are so complex we can't predict, or we're ignorant of the causes. Simple as that. It's basically, in essence, it's the word we give to our ignorance. You might just call it mystery. That's another word for it, if you like, mystery. Right? So randomness is so, because randomness, true randomness, in the sense the atheists intend it, is impossible, because that means there's a causality. So something happens for no cause at all whatsoever. Something comes from absolute nothing. That's the randomness that atheists mean, and that just can't exist. It's a contradiction in terms, because from nothing comes, as the Greek philosopher said. And so, yeah, that's so I concur on that matter.
Okay, let's play some more and see what else he comes up with.
But where does that come from?
You were about to say something?
Yeah, where does it come from?
It comes from a random accident in chemistry at sometime around 3.8 to 4 billion years ago.
Look at the confidence. One thing I have to give to them is the level of certainty with which they speak. It was a random accident 3.8 billion years ago.
Yes, indeed. But as I said, because they're so entrenched in their dogma, that their blind faith in it, so intractable that they can't but have confidence. The moment they start to doubt it and say, actually, maybe we could be wrong, brings in the question, well, then God is a viable hypothesis at the very least, and therefore you then can't make fun of it. At the very least, you can't make fun of it. You can't decry people for believing in God. You can't lampoon or mock them for believing in God. But their main weapon against theism is to mock and lampoon, and therefore they have to reject the viability of God as even a hypothesis, something that should at least be considered to see if it actually has merit. So they've obviously rejected it offhand. At least Richard Dawkins hasn't given a reason as to why it should be rejected and not taken seriously as a very possibility at the very least. So it's their epistemological arrogance, which I find unreasonable and also very off-putting for being for themselves. It's a character flaw, to say the least, in themselves. They really should have epistemic humility, I believe. I think that's what your colleague Hamza also said. He used the word epistemic humility.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what? Okay, but what? I don't want to labour this point, but I'm genuinely fascinated. Genuinely.
Okay.
So it happened 4 billion years ago. There was this chemical thing, whatever. But what was there before the chemical thing?
Oh well, there was chemistry. There was plenty going on before then, because we've got about 11 billion years, 10 million years to play with there, so there was plenty going on. What happened 4 billion years ago was a spontaneous, accidental arising of a molecule which made copies of itself. That was a very improbable event, admittedly, a very improbable event. But once it happened, then everything about biology was able to take over.
This reminds me of that saying, give us one miracle and we'll explain the rest. Just give us the first self-replicating molecule and we'll explain through natural selection and random copying errors the rest of life.
Yeah. Well, this is mirrored by the same thing which some atheist physicists are saying, which is they say that if there is a certain quantum event before the universe existed, which reaches a certain threshold of energy and what have you, then once we have that quantum nucleus, we can then explain the Big Bang and so on and so forth. But we need that quantum event to happen first. And this is what they will say is this. They'll say that there is no such thing as nothing. There's just quantum fluctuations within things which are nothing. And so these quantum fluctuations have a non-zero chance of having enough power fluctuation to occur that produces a special quantum nucleus that then would produce the universe and the Big Bang and so on and so forth. And I say one of the problems I've raised is that you're not explaining where the quantum fluctuation comes from. Right? You're just simply saying there's a non-zero chance. They say that probability says it's a non-zero chance of a quantum fluctuation occurring, and it is and then once it occurs, we can explain the rest of the universe. So we just need to see if we can prove that the existence of this quantum fluctuation and blah blah. And I say, okay. When they say non-zero chance, right? Because we see quantum fluctuations within space and time, right? Within universe, and they change. They seem to be part of space and time, not outside it. But it's like me saying, I go to London and I start to examine everybody's ovens. There's a non-zero chance that I will find dough in somebody's, bread dough with yeast in it, in somebody's oven. Now, if I can find in someone's oven, then I can explain that there will be bread produced, right? I know all the mathematics to explain the production of bread. I just need to find the dough. I was like, okay, that's great. And yes, it's true. There's a non-zero chance. So you're going to find it. You're going to eventually there's one person's oven that has the dough. But there's a big elephant in the room, which is, where did the dough come from, right? And who put the yeast in it, right? Where did it come from, right? This is the intractable problem, the inescapable problem that materialists can't answer, which is how did you get to that point, the sweet point you want, the point that you can then explain everything from? How did you get to that point? They can't explain it, and of course, they avoid the most obvious explanation. Now, I'm not saying that this also applies with the first, protein or what have you, or replicating molecules. I'm not saying that's the case with life, because with the universe, we're talking about something coming from nothing, whereas within the universe, we're talking about something coming from something else, right? So obviously they're not that comparable. But the point is that there's a mirroring that the atheists they know how to explain things. Well, I was an atheist. Physicists and biologists know how to explain things from a certain point. But the atheist makes claims about what happened before that point, and there might not be evidence for it, and it might be incredibly unlikely, in fact, astronomically unlikely. But that doesn't faze them, because they'll say, no, we're waiting that we're waiting at any moment we'll find the answer to that, and then we can remove God from the equation completely. Now, I'm not saying, as I said, if abiogenesis is shown, no problem for us. God made a universe with the laws of physics to be the exact precise way that they would allow atoms to exist, and then later on more complex things. Okay, maybe it was that, or maybe he did indeed mold and move matter. Maybe he moves the universe constantly by actually determining the quantum fluctuations that occur, which do have macro effects, bigger effects. So maybe he's constantly determining what's happening, as opposed to okay, I want to be precise on this. Maybe he's constantly interacting with the universe, rather than just like sustaining it with a set of laws that run continually, but rather he's sustaining it and he's making determinations of every point in it continually, such that you cannot predict, because you can't predict quantum fluctuations. Whereas in essence, I want to be clear for everybody here. So because the creative universe is sustaining the universe. Does he sustain the universe in the way such as he's made determination at the beginning of the universe, and then the universe continues along that determination, or he's made a predetermination for the universe, but he's moving the things in the universe to fit that determination he's made? Allahu Alam, we don't know the full how he maintains the universe, how he sustains it, how he molds and shapes and directs it. We don't know how. We know that he predetermined everything. So because that's the fact that his knowledge is not limited by time and space, so he's predetermined everything that would occur. But how does he interact with the universe? Because the very definition of miracle is, that the creator of the universe changes something in the universe. But what if every moment of the universe depends on God making the change, right? So you see my point. It's a bit more nuanced, and it would mean that, in essence, every moment is a miracle, because the creator universe is active. Well, actually, you could say every moment is a miracle, because every moment is coming about by the interaction of the creator with his creation, at the very least sustaining it. So then abiogenesis would be a miracle as much as anything else would be, a general miracle. Then there are specific miracles that only prophets are given, and that's a separate category, of course, which I won't go into. But anyway, I'm just telling you that theologically speaking, it doesn't bother us which way it goes. But the atheist, I said, is so desperate that it must be there must be no clear and observable direct breaking of the laws of the universe, or a direct change induced in the universe by the creator of the universe. It must be appearing to be no divine intervention, even though we would say that every moment is divine intervention. I think that's the best way. That's what I'm really trying to say, is every moment is divine intervention. But anyway, so just want to raise that point, that the atheists, they have this desired start point that they think that they can explain everything from, but they can't get to that start point. They don't know how to explain what happened before that start point.
Absolutely, and it goes back to that Zeno's paradox that you spoke about before, that you just keep going back and back and back, and eventually there has to be an explanation for everything that cannot be in the same way, in the same matter, energy, time, all of these things going back it will point you towards God. It will point you towards something that has to be able to conceptually explain everything. And then when it does, then it doesn't matter whether it's, like you mentioned, Abdullah, through primary causation, where God is directly controlling everything, or whether it's through secondary causation, where God has created laws and then those laws are the cause by which everything's coming around. But our explanation from a theistic perspective is all comprehensive. It explains everything in one sweeping go, when what we find with these atheists is they just have to, you know, deal with all these conceptual holes and they're not able to actually address them.
Yeah, they're the ones that are desperate for skewing the scientific results in a certain way. They want, or at least producing interpretations that support them in a certain way. Whereas for us, we're happy to see wherever the science goes. We don't have a bias in terms of how did God will that things would work within the universe. Well, for us, it's like, well, we want to discover this. The Quran tells us to go and observe, you know, how the camels are created, how the mountains are created. The Quran tells us to observe the heavens and the earth, to see how God made things. We're not biased in any one particular way, but for atheists, they must argue for that the scientific results must be a certain way that preclude the existence of God, even though when it comes to the origin of the universe, science can't really go beyond that. And of course, for abiogenesis, I mean, that remains to be seen, as I said, although it's incredibly unlikely at this point in time.
Yeah.
You're making a number of informed assumptions based on what you believe happened, but you do concede that you don't know what happened before all that, because your brain, like mine, cannot compute that. So do you accept that stuff could have gone on before that, which makes everything you're saying completely wrong?
You're talking about two different kinds of before. You're talking about the origin of the universe, and now we're talking about the origin of life.
Well, I'm just saying, if you go,
okay,
but I'm saying if you go back generally billions of years, none of us were there, right? Everyone's got their view about what may or may not have happened. But do you accept that the way that your brain has computed what is likely to have happened to get us to where we are today, it could be based on a false original pretext?
I accepted that for the origin of the universe, which is another matter. Now we're talking about the origin of life. And again, we don't know how that happened, but there's nothing like so mysterious as the origin of the universe. The origin of life is a tractable problem. It may never be solved, but it's not in the same league as the origin of the universe. Now, the origin of life is something which chemists are working on, and they may solve it in a certain sense. They may find a suitable model, a plausible model of how a self-replicating molecule came into existence. There's no mystery about there being chemistry before then. There was chemistry before then. There was plenty of organic chemistry going on. Now, at somewhere around 4 billion years ago, a molecule arose which had the unusual property, not totally impossible, but unusual property of making copies of itself. Now, once that happened, then you have the possibility of Darwinian life getting going. And that's something which we understand. And we understand in principle the kind of thing that could have given rise to that first self-replicating molecule. And it's an active field of research, but it's not a field that is necessarily going to yield results, because it happened a long time ago under conditions that we can't repeat now. But that's not a big mystery like the origin of the universe.
But are they not? Okay, but are they? I hear what you say, but are they?
Before we get into, I mean, I found that Piers here, because his line of questioning is muddying the waters. He actually had Dawkins in a good place prior to this, but now he's trying to link the origin of life question with the origin of universe question and saying, well, okay, so even if you have an idea of what the origin of life is like, you don't know what the origin of the universe is like, so you're still in the same boat as me. Well, you don't necessarily need to do that. Let's just stick to the origin of life, because it's enough for us to accept right now that all of these things that are being mentioned by Dawkins about the self-replicating molecule, and it came about through an accident, and that random copying errors, it can actually evolve and change, and now we have a Darwinian explanation which then explains life. let's stick to that, because this idea that, okay, so what we're going to have is we're going to have a self-replicating molecule, and there's copying errors, so there's an ability to change, which is going to be selected. Therefore, we can explain all of the biodiversity that we see, the blade of a grass, or a whale, or a Homo sapien, or whatever it is. That idea in of itself is ludicrous. Just that idea itself, that a small copying errors and natural selection working on this conceptually can explain all of the billions of species that have ever existed. It's absolutely amazing that this is the best explanation that the Darwinists actually have for the origin of species.
Yeah. I mean, I concur. I mean, like as I said, they'll clasp at straws because they need to hold those straws. The straws of their hypothesis. It doesn't matter how unlikely it is. One would argue, at least go for the most likely explanation. The most likeliest explanation is that, well, some might say that if life is intentional, then there's intent behind life. It's as simple as that. At least say that was a respectable hypothesis at the very least. I mean, sure, you can try to experiment to see if it was if life came about by the process of the universe. But we'd still say that's intent, but at least maybe say that, well, let's just see if that's not the case. Does this preclude that possibility at the very least? But we will at least hold the God as a respectable hypothesis that does explain things which are incredibly unlikely. Some people have defined miracles as things which are incredibly unlikely. So at least then say, all right, well, at least respect it in that sense. But they don't, because they've already assumed the conclusion they're looking for, which is natural, philosophical naturalism. There is nothing beyond the material world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not directly connected, in the sense, if you don't understand or know how the universe began or what was there before then can you really fully understand the origin of life? I mean, you can have some clues about what may have ignited life.
Not really. No, they're not really connected, because the origin of the universe is a mystery, but we know that it did originate, and it was going for 10 billion years before life started.
But how do we know? How do we know the origin of the universe did happen the way you think? How do we know it originated?
We know that it's 13.8 billion years old because of various things which astronomers can tell you. I mean, Hubble's law and extrapolating back with all sorts of things like that, which are very well known and very well understood, but not the moment of the Big Bang itself. But once you've got that, then physicists know a lot. But we're not talking about that. I'm talking now about
I get it.
You are talking now about the origin of life.
I understand there are two different things in your head, but I'm saying that the two can't be completely disconnected, because clearly your belief is that the Big Bang happened, the universe was created, and then many billions of years later we have the origin of life. I get that. But my point to you is the two must be directly linked. You can't have origin of life without origin of the universe. And my problem with all this is I don't think people really... Well, can you? Can you have the two things separate?
Of course not. They're linked by 10 billion years of happenings, and we know, we understand about that. The galaxies formed, the stars formed, chemistry formed.
Right. So how can you fully understand the origin of life?
Formed.
Right. So how do you fully understand the origin of life without fully understanding, because we don't know, the origin of the universe?
Now, the thing is here, Piers is making an argument which can be made, which is you cannot truly understand the nature of life, because life is made of matter, until you understand the origin of matter. But I don't think he needs to make that argument, because in a way he's conceding the ground to Dawkins and saying, yeah, you have these explanations for the origin of life, but you don't have an explanation for the origin of the universe. So since you don't have an explanation for the origin of the universe, you can't have an explanation for the origin of life, which is sufficient enough. Well, actually, why don't we just stick to that? Why don't we just stick to the origin of life? Because we have consciousness, we have intentionality, we can think about something, right? That is inexplainable from a naturalistic perspective, because if we are at rock bottom, matter, then there is no such thing as the mind. The mind is simply the brain at work, right? You'll have to subscribe to some form of monism, but we have the ability to make decisions. We can think about things. Now, I interviewed a few weeks back Alex Rosenberg, who's a mad dog naturalist, and he's finding it difficult, and so are many naturalists, to try and explain intentionality, to try and explain, the manifest image. How is it that we're having these third person subjective experiences? That is something I think Piers Morgan should have pressed him on, because from a Darwinian perspective, at absolute best conceptually, Darwinism can explain physical traits, but it cannot explain the mind.
Oh no, of course. Now, as I said, and I think this is where Richard Dawkins and Piers Morgan have finally caught on to what we obviously knew was going to have to be the case, which is that you can't have an explanation of life without an explanation of the universe, because life is part of the universe, and so if the universe is explained by God, then ultimately that means life too is explained by God. That if God intended the universe which would have the particular laws of physics that it does have, which allows life to come about, then clearly God intended life to come about and created laws of physics in such a way that they would be bound to create the life that God intended to see arise in the very shape and form that God intended to see rise in that. So of course there is a linkage between the two, and you raised a good point about well, what about the mind? The mind is not explainable via matter. What's doing the observing in us? Like you're being observed by a camera, but the camera doesn't see. The camera detects light like our eyes do, transmits into electrical signals like our nervous system does, but the camera doesn't see what it's transmitting. It's just simply a device that is doing these processes. But there's something behind our eyes, so to speak, that's doing the observing, that's seeing us see the light, it's hearing us hear the sound waves, that's what it is experiencing. How to explain this in a pure material way? Which quantum particle, if you want to reduce it down to which is the quantum particle that's doing the looking, the viewing, that has a bit of popcorn next to it, a quark, which quark has a bit of popcorn next to it, watching all this and seeing all this and experiencing all this, right? Because subatomic particles appear at least not to be living and certainly not experiencing, right? So then which part of these lifeless matter is doing the living in the sense of the experiencing of these sensations that we clearly are experiencing ourselves? We clearly know about. So which part of matter is doing this? And that's a problem that is, again, inescapable for atheists to resolve. The hard problem of consciousness. They don't know how to resolve it. They simply say, we'll find an answer in some point in time. Science will deliver the answer, which is also a faith as well, that in the future, like you can't predict the future. How do you know if science will, even if it can? Because science only deals with the movement of physical things. It doesn't deal with more than that, ultimately speaking. So of course these are again holes in their worldview that they can't explain, and yet they're so desperate to do so that they're going to use the most wackiest of theories and hypotheses, despite the fact they have no evidence. They have no more evidence than as I said, Zeus and Jupiter and Athena and all these Greek idols and what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to whether science can answer the mind-body problem, Michael Ruse, who is a respected philosopher, atheist philosopher, I had him on the channel a few months back, and he thought it's just not possible for science to deal with the mind-body problem. He thought it was beyond the capability of science because of the nature of the problem. Now, the hard problem of consciousness is actually getting harder. And one of the reasons it's getting harder, it's not just a first-person subjective experience, but it's also that we have many different processes happening within us. So one process is me looking at you, and we're interacting, and we're having these experiences. But there's another element that when I'm asleep, my body is going through many different processes. Cells are dividing. I am breathing. These things are happening with a level of cognition, with a level of consciousness, you could say. I recently interviewed James Shapiro, who is speaking about the fact that all cells are cognitive. This is something he published with Nature back in 2020. And the title of the paper was actually that all cells are cognitive. And what he means by cognition is action based on knowledge. So cells actually make decisions. Cells can actually modify their DNA. They can read their DNA dynamically in response to environmental conditions. So there is a level of intelligence at that very, say, we're blind to that level. We are not in a way able to influence that level, yet it's something absolutely crucial for us to survive. So these types of problems are only getting worse, and it's better for the likes of Dawkins to revise his statement, genes created us, body and mind, and actually say genes can potentially only create us body. And that obviously can get challenged with the integrative approach, but at least be humble with your starting point, because the problem is they start off with these assumptions and they pretend as if these assumptions are proven facts, when we conceptually haven't even sorted out the architecture. What exactly do we mean by these terms? I'll give you an example. Gene, just the term gene has not been agreed upon. Gene, according to some, is a strand of DNA. Gene, according to some, is anything that is inherited. Both of these are contradictory. In fact, when I asked James Shapiro about what is a gene, and this is something that he concurs with Dennis Noble with, is we basically don't have an answer to this. Yet we are being told genes created us mind and body. The genome is sealed off from the rest of the world. Genes are replicators. We're merely vehicles. The ultimate rationale of life is the preservation of our genes. We're being told all these narratives, yet we haven't sorted out not only the scientific evidence for this perspective or the arguments, but even conceptually what any of these things actually mean. And this is absolutely shocking that all of these categorical statements are being made when we haven't sorted out any of this. We haven't even begun to understand how to sort this out from a definition point of view.
Yeah, well, definitely. That's what I'm saying, that I've said before, which is, as I said, I can concur with our colleague Hamza Zortz's. These atheists lack epistemic humility. For those who don't know the word, it's epistemic. Epistemology is about about the study of knowing. How do you know something? How do you know something certain or definite or probative or not? So has a probability behind it or what have you, or the degree of probability. This is all epistemology. So epistemic humility is not claiming to know things that you with a certainty that you clearly lack. And we wished many of these atheists, like Richard Dawkins, possessed that humility.
Absolutely. It's now the final part, just the last minute or so.
Well, you don't understand anything on that argument if you don't understand the origin of the universe. The origin of the universe is another matter. Once you've got the origin of the universe, then you've got a whole lot of things that happen, which we know very well. That's history. We understand that. We know that. That's well worked out. And then the origin of life is something that happened about 10 billion years after the origin of the universe. And that's something which is still a mystery, but a rather small mystery compared to the origin of the universe. And it's something which is being worked on. And once that happened, we then got the whole 4 billion years of life. And that we understand much better. And that happens to be my field.
Okay. I'm curious about your position about religion, because you went on.
Okay, so now they're going to start talking about him being a cultural Christian and all of that. We're not really interested in having that long conversation. Thank you, Abdullah, for giving me your time. MashaAllah, 2 hours, 15 minutes. But for the closing remarks, what would you say to Dawkins, confident assertions that he repeats like a mantra, and which are then being repeated all across the internet, is being repeated by people in colleges and universities for the last 3 decades. He's had this very strong narrative, and people have just been regurgitating without even understanding that he himself cannot defend any of these positions.
I would say that, and this is something which, again, our mutual colleague and friend Hamza Zortz has said, which is they should be skeptical on their skepticism. Right, their dogmatic drive to be skeptical, even in places where it goes too far, to the extreme, the point that they even are skeptical against reason, at the very least, just reasonable hypotheses that have not been precluded by the evidence. Right, at least hold it as a possibility, a respectable one. That's all. Right, but they don't. And this is the problem. This is the issue, is that look, okay, so they might argue, and they probably would say, well, you say that God is the only possible explanation, so you clearly have reached that certainty yourself. So is that not contradicting your argument about epistemic humility? And I say, yeah, epistemic humility when you don't have certainty. But if every possibility other than God produces a contradiction, and every conceivable and even inconceivable, so literally there is no other possibility, the law of exclude the middle, means that either things are finite or infinite, either things are dependent or independent. There's no third possibility. And when you've tried all the things which are to say that maybe this universe depends on something dependent, depends on something finite, depends on whatever, you reach a contradiction, which means it's false. And that's the only basis we have to know things are false. Then the only thing that's left, so the only explanation that's left, is the creator of the universe. That was how I reached my certainty. It was only because I literally excluded all the others because they produce contradictions, right? And that's the way to exclude things, is they produce contradictions. But Dawkins and atheists like him, so atheists like him as in atheists who are like him, right? Not all atheists. Some are just maybe they're still searching, they're confused, they're still learning. But atheists who are like Richard Dawkins, they have jumped on the bandwagon of certainty a little too prematurely, to say the least. And they are asserting boldly, proudly, confidently, it's not God, there's no God here. There's going to be a naturalistic explanation for this. 100% certain. As certain as some of the ancient Greeks who said that the planets were revolving around the Earth in circular orbits, because circular orbits are the perfect shape for orbits, right? They said it was because it has to be, because it's this is a nice complete explanation within our worldview, but then their worldview gets proven wrong, and the atheists sometimes use this against us. They say that people made assumptions, that they explain things in a certain way and they got disproven. I say they explained things happening in the universe due to a certain configuration of the universe. Well, the universe works in this way and it doesn't. That's where they made their mistake. But we're saying that, wait a second, we're saying that we're not trying to explain what happens in the universe, the how. We're just simply saying we want to find out, although we are fascinated by that, and we do search for it, but we want to ask the question, why? What is beyond the universe which caused the universe to be this way? The universe is not a complete explanation within itself. It can't explain energy. It can't explain space and time. What's it made out of? What's the extension made out of? What happened before the beginning of the Big Bang? What caused the beginning of the Big Bang? If time equals zero, then space and time equals zero. So space equals zero. So there was no energy, no matter, no space, no time. So there was nothing. We know that nothing can't produce anything. So we want to know why. Yes, after something begins to exist, yes, let's see how this thing works. Great, like the mechanic. Let's study the car, how it works. Excellent. But I want to study who made the car, why they made the car, what was the intent behind the car. That's the question that we are asking. And that is not an explanation about how the universe works, to which an experiment will prove us wrong, but is the inescapable question that in reality atheists who might be physicists or biologists are constantly running from. And it's causing them to skew the results and interpretations of their experiments to desperately show that the universe is some kind of self-contained, kind of self-sustaining and independent thing. The universe is a god, basically. It is not. Clearly, it is not. And there's constant problems with this, and they are burying their head in the sand, and they're just saying, "Don't worry, we'll find the solution to that, which will be within the self-contained model we have." But no, the universe is insufficient an explanation for itself, and we want to ask, what is? And there's only one thing that is: the creative universe, God.
Absolutely. And they need to admit that naturalism is a faith, and it's leading them to these absurdities and these contradictions and these types of arguments, which ultimately they will always be firefighting with the evidence. Some new evidence comes and they'll just be taking out their hoses and trying to put it out. From our perspective, there is no firefighting to do, because we have an answer which explains everything. And in fact, you need that answer even for reason to work. So something that Dawkins was mentioning about, well, we can't even trust our intuition because, ultimately it's an evolved entity. Well, okay, so if we can survive on false beliefs and true beliefs, and if we can't track truth and if we can't value truth, then what's the point of even bothering with the scientific enterprise or with moral questions or existential questions? Why don't we just give up? Well, we shouldn't give up, because we do actually have the ability to reason, to arrive at truth. We can value truth and we can value moral reasoning and these things, because we are the creation of an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfect being. It explains everything. It's the beginning of human knowledge. In fact, I wanted to recommend a book which is a real eye-opener in terms of the history of science, written by Patricia Farah. It's called Science, a 4,000-year history. And what you're going to see is what Abdullah was saying earlier, that science is a theistic enterprise, because the scientific worldview requires a background metaphysical perspective, which theism provides and which atheism cannot provide. So brothers and sisters, Jazakallah khair for joining us on this live stream. Abdullah, I'm going to have to bring you back soon. It was really nice speaking to you, and it's really lovely hearing your perspective.
What, you're not tired of me already? After 2 hours of hearing me yap?
No, it was fun. It was fun. We haven't done this in a while, mashallah. So enjoy your time at the farm.
Yes. I'm just my family farm in Portugal, and yes, seeing family here, alhamdulillah. And it's great. And inshallah, I'll be back to UK once the race riots die down. Ironically, though, I'm probably in the same. I'm in the same peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, as one of the instigators of the race riots. Apparently, Tommy Robinson, arguably one of the instigators, anyway. But yeah, I came here not to run away, but to see family. He has his own reasons. But anyway, yes, he's in Spain. All right then. Well, yes, Barakallahu feekum, brother. Thank you for inviting me. And I said it's great to hear your knowledge on your studies of genetics and your many debates with geneticists, and may Allah strengthen you and preserve you and continue in this very important path of engaging atheists who hide behind the ambiguities of science to mislead the people, but ultimately mislead themselves. And inshallah, may many people continue to be guided by your work.
Ameen. Jazakallah khair wa iyak. Assalamu alaikum.